Hi friends, this is Shelly Wilson. I'm happy to welcome you to this sermon and to have spent time with you in this service of worship. So my sermon today is called Watching the Tree. And I have been thinking about the fact that if you possibly have any spare brain space for this notion, which to be honest, I really don't this year, today is Trinity Sunday, a day that occurs every year on the liturgical calendar when we're meant, at least usually most years, to be thinking in depth about the great mystery, the interesting mystery that is God the Creator, Jesus the Christ, and the Holy Spirit. For me, it's somewhat of an odd and awkward metaphor, but I also sort of like it because if we let it, such an idea can move us toward a spacious, big spirituality, an understanding hope that is bound and rooted in hope and inclusion, that because God is one and God is also many, that we also can be one in ourselves and also inclusive and love the many. Holy, holy, holy. But this year, maybe honestly, every year, I think it is probably quite past time for me and maybe for most of the rest of us to be concerning our pretty little heads about any theological construct that isn't leading directly to learning and action that helps to preserve the earth and all of us human beings, all of us, helping us to survive this challenging time and to find our way back to some sort of soul integrity, both as individuals and as a nation, to figure out new ways or even to reconnect to the old ways in some way of finding justice and honor and finally moving toward real new reparation. The other day at Trinity UCC in St. Pete, we did our first experiment in coming back together again physically in a world that is raging with COVID-19 and racism. It was, admittedly, a baby step, but we were excited to begin. We have a Tuesday discussion group that gathered every week before the pandemic started, and so last Tuesday we gathered in our courtyard outside our church building at a safe distance with our masks on, cloistered in that beautiful courtyard inside the surround of the building. Gathered for a writing exercise that was founded and focused on our great old eastern cedar, a beautiful tree that spreads its huge arms over the courtyard's garden. Our writing prompt had at the top the Japanese character for tree, mu. It looks like this. It's a trinity, 3 strokes that form the trunk, the roots, and the branches reaching up into heaven. It symbolizes the relationship between the life force that lives in all the creation and God, the Tao, if you will, the life force that flows through us and flows through trees and flows through all the creation. Absorb, 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 which is what a tree does. Our particular tree is sheltered where it stands surrounded by the church building, and as well it shelters all who gather near it. People with many hues of pigment in their skin and speaking many different languages and coming from different cultures rest in its shade when church activities are in full swing there. You can sense the peace of the place and of the tree. It's always been used for good, always been a place of comfort and safety. When it needed to be pruned a couple of weeks ago, The parts were cut up to nourish other life forms. No part of this tree has ever been made into a bludgeon or a cross or a gun. Our cedar tree has never been a lynching tree. Back in the day, specifically between 1880 and 1940 or so, trees were abused that way, turned into lynching trees. When Dr. James Cone, the great Black liberation theologian of Union Theological Seminary, wrote his important work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, in 2011, he clearly compared the cross of Christ, where Jesus was put to death unjustly, hung on a tree, as the book of Acts put it, compared that to the lynching tree. And he notes, and I quote, "White Christians lynched nearly 5,000 black men and women in a manner with obvious echoes of the Roman crucifixion of Jesus, and yet these Christians did not see the irony or the contradictions in their actions," end quote. And so it comes back to that inescapable call upon our lives to see that as Christians, any injustice in our society is our business and requires of us a response. When the Reverend William Barber of the New Poor People's Campaign formed his movement some years back, he called it a moral revival. A moral revival because we must, in society and within ourselves, challenge the evils in our world again and again, the evils of white supremacy and poverty and disease, and our national distorted moral sensibility. And I believe that is what we're witnessing all around us in these hard, hard days. It is a pattern like rings on a desecrated tree, it seems. We see the pattern over and over again. Crucifixion and lynching and shooting and helicopters and dogs and fire hoses and epithets and unequal education and mass incarceration and voting rights suppression and microaggressions and internalized racism and fear and anger and the returning of evil for evil. And nevertheless, the prophets persist and speak again and again the clarion call of God's justice to God's people. The clarion call of God to us to be about the work of justice, inclusion, and love. Let my people go. Dr. Cone said, quote, "The cross can heal and hurt. It can be empowering and liberating, but also enslaving and oppressive. There is no one way in which the cross can be interpreted. I offer my reflections because I believe that the cross placed alongside the lynching tree can help us to see Jesus in America in a new light, and thereby empower people who claim to follow him to take a stand against white supremacy and every kind of injustice." End quote. God in creation, God in others, God in the peaceful tree and in the cross, and beyond the cruelty and the pain, that God is relentlessly calling us in the majority culture to reject our racist heritage, to learn and to do better, calling me to wake up spiritually, emotionally, physically, to remember, in the words of the old prophets, to repair the breach. our work as white Christians is clear, and it has two parts. First, to begin again and again the lifelong work of re-education and moral transformation in our individual selves, looking directly and fearlessly, without leaning on defensiveness and excuses and white fragility, looking at our own racial heritage clearly. To write a racial autobiography, to courageously listen and learn, and to expect that that important inner work will be hard. It is hard. It involves truth-telling. It involves listening and paying attention to others' experiences. It means, like Susan wrote in her Moo meditation, it means not looking away. Not looking away until our souls are broken open by the reality of the injustice and the suffering of black and brown people and the ways that white privilege can remain unconscious to those realities and thus be complicit in them. And then the second part of our work is to work with humility to change our culture. And we have to do, I think, the first work, as if not before, we attempt to do the second. You know why? Because as white people, we live and move and have our being with the blinders on of white privilege. White privilege blocks our view, limits our understanding, so that even if we do a lot of good deeds, the apparatus of privilege blocks our spiritual view so much that we only see our own reality and we remain asleep to the realities around us and to our own racism. So much that we continue to experience life in the way that we do, and we believe that life as we know it is the same experience for everyone. And it isn't. We tend to experience life the way people do who experience secondhand smoke. We aren't directly, physically impacted most days by white privilege and the racism that hurts our brothers and sisters of color. But because we're not actively affected by it, we still are participating in the racist rhetoric and abuse and being complicit in it. And without our inner work, we can stay asleep, turn off the TV, and live contentedly because we're not directly affected. And then we say things like, oh, I don't see color. All lives matter. Well, we do see color. It's not true to say we don't. And if we don't, we should. We should see color. We should celebrate color and diversity and become culturally competent. And to say that we don't see it is to lie to ourselves and to minimize the realities of other people's experiences. And of course, all lives matter. But all lives are not getting lynched. Black lives matter and must be our priority. Doing our inner work is so important for all of us who identify as white people, because it isn't enough in this frightening world for us to be well-meaning. That is not enough. We have to be awake and working to learn how to be anti-racist. I do not want to continue to be blinded by these blinders that I wear, blinded by my own racism and complicit with its death-dealing ways in our society. I don't want to be blinded by those blinders and fall asleep at the wheel of reality, lulled by my self-justification. Jesus' friends and followers didn't physically hang him on the tree themselves, but many of them did turn away. And they said, "I never knew him." The good news and the hope of our faith and our calling is that in the paradox of life and death, even in the middle of this awful time, there are so many resources and so many people finding their souls again, working to resist the evil. But it is, make no mistake, a work in progress. And like living with the other virus, this virus of racism is here, and it is subtle sometimes, and it requires perseverance as we work hard to eradicate it. But we have so many good examples to follow. Jesus of Nazareth and all the saints through the years, and the unsung saints and heroes all around us today who are courageously working on themselves and working through their communities of faith and their friendships and their connections to change things. Will we do it right every time as we're growing in grace and working for change? No, we'll mess up. But as Christians, we must continue to do that work without excuses. Mess up and try again. And not just every now and then when some new atrocity happens and then we feel guilty, but every day. Recommit ourselves to the courage that it takes now more than ever to do the work of removing our blinders, dismantling the injustice, crossing the borders, and re-energizing our exhausted souls. There are lots and lots of responses to the virus out in the world today. Some deny it. Some refuse to protect themselves against it and thus infect others. And some are learning all they can and working for healing. What is hopeful is that you and I can choose those latter options. We can be like the tree, strong in our spiritual center in God, rooted in the earth, with our arms outstretched up to God and out toward one another, determined to absorb the truth and to work for the highest good for all. We can traverse this challenging cultural landscape while we are awake and awakening every day. We can change our racist past and present, make it new. We can learn from it and make a new tomorrow, freer from the viruses of hatred. When Black Lives Matter, lives are changed. Lives are saved. Healing happens. Borders are crossed. Walls come crashing down. People of faith and strength and conviction are reading and joining in sacred conversations to change racism within. Other people are running for office and helping get out the vote and working for climate restoration and human health based on science, and doing insistent advocacy and marching in the streets and investigating what is happening in our own town, in our own county, in our own state, and working in our own context and in our own family, whatever that means for us, to help bring everyone to a place at the table. There are courageous educators and employers figuring out how to help children and youth and families. There are social workers and physicians and health care workers and other essential workers all around the world. joining to learn and listen and march and to say to one another, do not lose heart. It is undeniably painful and costly and essential work that we are called to do. We are constantly working to shake ourselves awake over and over again as the majority culture. And it is also life-giving and joyful. It is an adventure. It is an opportunity to have new life. Martin Luther King called it the beloved community. And forming it is the call of every Christian. It is not a one and done. It is every day for all of our lives, growing toward one another like tree branches with glorious leaves and fruit. Clarence Page, in his beautiful essay, Showing My Color, Impolite Essays on Race and Identity, wrote these words, quote, Americans of all colors are PLWRs, people living with racism. Sometimes we get it, and sometimes it gets us. With a new racial vision for our nature's future, we Americans might yet trade in our new current anthem, The Whine, for the 1970s disco hit, I Will Survive. It has got a good beat, and we can dance to it. End quote. Together, friends, we shall overcome. Let racial justice and love begin anew. May peace and racial justice, but first, racial justice, begin with me, begin with us, and let's do it today. Let's begin it anew today.